Thrice. After me, Grassley, then you.
If Grassley don't show up.
Then you. What's that?
Pretty good. You got a solvent arm, or textured arm.
Next I have to say purple and gold. You know, what is that?
Grassley's running a little bit late, so we're going to skip Grassley and go Tuberville and Clement.
Gotcha.
Go Grassley when he gets there.
Sounds good. And will you ask Stephen to put my cup right there? Hey, y'all. Thanks for being here. Anyone with a college-age child knows that college costs are soaring, not just for professional school, but for every school, including state universities. And they've jumped 80% overall at private nonprofit colleges. At public four-year institutions over the last 30 years, they've gone up 124%. And there's research showing that the current federal higher education financing system actually contributes to the problem more than addresses the solution. Some colleges and universities have used the availability of federal loans to increase tuitions, and this has left many students drowning in debt with no pathway for success. President Biden's answer was to enact his $400 billion student debt scheme, which doesn't forgive debt. It merely transfers the responsibility to pay it back away from the person who willingly took on the debt to taxpayers who maybe never went to college, paid back their student loans, in some cases sacrificing lifestyle in order to pay back those student loans. And by the way, President Biden's scheme does nothing to drive the underlying cause of the debt crisis. According to the Center for a Responsible Federal Budget, if this student debt loan transfer goes into effect, students and taxpayers will be back in the same situation in 5 years. Total debt at that point will be $1.6 trillion. This is not a fix. This is merely a Band-Aid, and the Band-Aid saddles taxpayers with a burden again in 5 years. That's why this morning we introduced the Lowering Education Cost and Debt Act, a package of 5 bills aimed at directly addressing the issues driving skyrocketing cost of higher education and the increasing amounts of debt students take on to attend school. And unlike President Biden's plan, this actually addresses the root causes of the student debt crisis. Our legislation puts downward pressure on tuition. It empowers students to make educational decisions that put them on the track to both academically and financially succeed. It simplifies the student loan borrowing and repayment process so students don't have to take out more loans than they need and can navigate the student loan process without confusion. I thank my colleagues, some of whom are with me today, for contributing to this effort. I'll first address the College Transparency Act, which has multiple co-sponsors, and then turn it over to Senator Grassley. The College Transparency Act recognizes that college education is one of the largest financial commitments many Americans make, but there's not that much information for students to know if they're making the right decision for the amount they're borrowing. Excuse me. Thank you.
What you got in there?
Yeah, really. You don't buy a car without the ability to compare prices, quality, and financing options. The same goes for buying a house. Why don't we do this for higher education? So, the way we envision the College Transparency Act, a student looks in the mirror, and whatever that student looks like, if he's a white male who's 65 years old, if he's a black male who's 18, if he's a black female who's 22, she or he looks in that mirror and sees, what do I look like? Who am I? What's my background? Then they'll be able to log on and compare, if I enter this curriculum at this college, this is my chance of graduating in this curriculum at this college. This is how much I will need to potentially borrow, and this is my earning potential when I graduate. So if somebody attempts to enroll in a university program in which they only have a 5% chance of graduating, but that first year they have to borrow $50,000 in cash, and when they graduate, they'll make $30,000. That would be a clear market signal. Don't enroll in that program. By the way, I say that because there's some universities that do extremely well at addressing racial disparity in graduation rates. And typically African American males, for example, have the lowest graduation rate. There's some universities with particular programs that eliminate that. So instead of graduating with debt, but not graduating but having debt, the young man would be able to graduate and pay back whatever debt he had to take on. It makes available information on cost, enrollment, retention, completion, and post-college earnings of a particular university or program of study. It also puts strict data security standards in place to make sure that an American's privacy is protected. With that, I'll turn over to Senator Grassley.
Thank you for your leadership in this area, and thank you for working with some of the ideas that I've had on this subject over a period of time. I'm here to speak about student being consumers of education and having the right information to know as they compare the cost of one college versus the other, the quality of one versus the other. So, quite obvious, students need clear information to shop around. You can't compare costs if you can't tell what the final cost is. The Government Accountant Office did a study, found 91% of the colleges understate their true cost, their cost in aid letters. So this focuses upon these letters. A third of the colleges don't distinguish in these letters between loans and grants. This bill, the Understanding the True Cost of College Act, creates a standard letter for easy comparisons. So if students are going to make wise choices about the cost of education and what sort of help they get to go to college, they ought to be comparing apples with apples, not apples with oranges. And the way the environment is today, you can't read one letter from one university and another from another one and know what the facts are. We need to get this information out and have a standard letter so you got the true facts you need to decide what college you want to go to.
Morning. Since I've been here for 3 years, all I've heard is if you're going to complain about something, try to fix it, and that's what we're trying to do today. I spent almost 40 years in this business of education. I've seen the ups and downs, the good and the bad and indifferent, and there's a lot of indifferent. So over that time, I've saw the cost of college go up and the quality of education go down. That's one of the main reasons I ran for this position. You know, young people are paying a lot more for education than higher education and getting a lot less, and that's wrong. More and more of our young people are starting their careers with a huge burden of debt, and it's unfortunate. As a result, many are putting off their goals like owning a home or starting a family. Debt is a problem. Democrats say the solution is to just give away more taxpayer dollars. But we've already tried that. And folks, it don't work. We got to put some solutions to it. The last 35 years have shown that a government blank check to the universities has made problems worse. I've seen it firsthand. Unlimited government loans have done nothing to increase access to education. All they've done is raise costs for students, whether they take a loan or not. Everybody's having to pay. Today, we're here to say enough's enough. I'm here with my colleagues to introduce a bill called the GOAL Act. How appropriate that is for me. I didn't score many touchdowns when I was coaching, but it's the GOAL Act.
Not against LSU.
Not against LSU, that's right. But it's about helping our young people achieve goals, like buying a house. The GOAL Act would set a maximum limit on federal graduate school loans, a limit. This would prevent some of the worst examples of students being exploited for profit. It would force schools to bring down cost and to compete for students. What an idea. It would also protect students from getting buried in debt they can never, ever pay. This legislation is just one step to restoring sanity in our education system. It's out of control. We have got our work cut out for us at all levels, especially the loan part. And as I said earlier, we complain about it, but we have solutions for it. We need to pass all these bills we're talking about today. But this legislation would bring a big step for all of our students. And so I'm proud to be here with my colleagues to lower costs for students, parents, and for taxpayers. That's what this is about.
I want to thank Dr. Cassidy and my colleagues for their leadership on this important issue. Of course, we all believe that access to education is key to the American dream, but not everybody needs to make the same choices. And what's happened, the system has been gamed, not necessarily to benefit the educational aspirations and achievement of a student, but rather to take advantage of the fact, as others have pointed out, that there are virtually unlimited amounts of money available to borrow to go to colleges and universities. And it's no coincidence as more money has become available and as the loans, the debts that students incur go up, that the tuition goes up. The colleges understand that very well. Again, we're not painting with a broad brush and saying everybody is guilty of gaming the system, but it certainly happens, and the consequences of it can be dire. First of all, we know the Biden administration has said the best way to deal with this is to cancel student loan debt. Well, you can't cancel a contract. And what they are suggesting, in essence, is transferring that liability to taxpayers. Again, not everybody decides to go to college, so why should they have to pay for your student loan debt if you did? If you decided to enter into a contract to repay that student loan and you don't do it, there should be consequences associated with it. There should be personal responsibility. But one of the things that is confusing about it is that there's so many different loan repayment systems. As a matter of fact, there are 9 different loan repayment systems. And what this bill would do in part would be to reduce that to 2, in other words, to simplify it. And it would also limit the ability to get federal loans to pay for deep degree programs that will not confer an education that will allow you to earn an income sufficient to repay that loan. In other words, this is something, again, that responsible colleges and universities do, but when you're a 17 or 18-year-old kid, you may not understand that all this debt you're incurring, that you're going to have to pay back sooner or later, and the course of studies that you're pursuing may not permit you to do that. So there needs to be a serious conversation between the schools and the students about practically how am I going to meet my responsibilities. So this bill will increase accountability and ensure student loans are paying for degrees that actually produce the higher income necessary for graduates to repay them, saving taxpayers nearly $50 billion. So I'm proud to join my colleagues in this important effort. This is a far superior way to deal with the problem of mounting student debt than what the Biden administration is doing, which undermines personal responsibility. There's no accountability for the colleges and universities that don't counsel their students about pursuing, not accumulating debt that will you won't be able to repay because you're not pursuing a degree that will allow you to get that sort of income. So kudos to Dr. Cassidy and his team and my colleagues for this legislation. This is a much better way, much more responsible, much more taxpayer-friendly way to deal with student debt than the Biden administration.
Lastly, I'll present Steve Daines's bill. If Grassley had requires the colleges to make their offer sheet common, okay, colleges, we want to be able to compare one college's offer to another. Daines speaks to the lending facility giving offer sheet to the prospective student. And this gives them better guidance. So the current process presents students with default loan amounts to choose from, and the students sometimes borrow more than they need, and have to pay back more than they can afford. The Informed Student Borrowing Act ensures students will be presented for the duration of their loan, expected monthly payment, how much money they will likely make in the future after attending the school and program of their choice, the percent of borrowers who are no longer enrolled in college but are in active repayment, the college completion rate for undergraduate borrowers, etc., that which the student needs to know to be able to figure out, am I going to be able to pay this back? It also requires the borrowers to annually receive this information through loan counseling to understand the value of their student loans. To summarize, the Biden administration's proposal merely transfers debts to taxpayers, but it does nothing to address the underlying issue, which is of people making poor choices or universities at times, some universities, exploiting the system. This kind of suite of ideas just seeks to correct that. And whereas the Biden administration, according to one estimate, does nothing to change the underlying drivers, but we will end up in this same situation again in 5 years, under this, it changes the underlying driver. The student, her family, will be able to make an informed choice, a wise choice, both for their education as well as for their financial future. With that, we'd love any questions that you have. Yes, sir.
Your colleague Bernie Sanders and other Democrats, they introduced legislation today called the College for All Act to, quote, make college tuition and debt free for working families. They say this will be paid for by their tax on Wall Street Speculation Act also introduced today. I wonder, what do you make of this legislation from progressives and more generally their efforts to cancel student loan debt?
You're never going to know how expensive something is until you make it free. And that's what we've found. As the federal government has sought to just be able to bail out the ability of a student to pay ever higher tuition, tuition is going ever higher. And the idea that we're going to tax corporate America to pay for this, the Biden administration has already proposed $4.5 trillion in new taxes on high earners and corporations. That does not include the trillions that they say they're going to propose to bail out Social Security, which is going insolvent in 9 years. And this would be even yet more money upon that. At some point, you have to laugh. Oh, I see. Your answer for this problem is the tax corporations. Your answer for that problem is the tax corporations. And your answer for that problem is the tax corporations. Come on. Let's have a serious response. We feel like ours are serious responses. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. Has Leader Schumer been receptive to this bill, and do you expect that he'll bring it to the Senate floor? And second, isn't the underlying problem with the increases in tuition have to do with government loans?
Two things. We have not yet brought this to Schumer, but why in the heck would John Cornyn's bill not be bipartisan? Or why wouldn't Coach's bill not be bipartisan? Or any of the bills that we've talked about. They're not partisan. They're something that just brings information to the student, whether as a student or as a borrower. So I'd like to think that if there is a package, that these would be included. The reasons for, and to your second part of your question, the reason for higher tuition is multifactorial. But one of them is clearly increased access to federal student loans. There's other reasons as well. But nonetheless, that's a major factor, and that's the one we're driving. Well, that's the driver that we're trying to get at. And guys, if y'all want to answer any of these questions.
Well,
yes, sir.
Let me just add, I just think, this does not serve the best interest of the student. Isn't that what we're most concerned with? That they get a good education, that they can actually, that will allow them to repay their loans. But this idea that that somehow the federal government's going to loan so much money, knowing that they have not gotten the guidance they need in order to know whether this is realistic, that you'll be able to actually pay it back. That does a disservice to the student. And the institutions of higher education, the ones that take advantage of this system, are continuing to reap in tuition dollars without performing the fundamental mission that they are supposed to be committed to. So this is more than just about the loans. This is about making sure that the incentives are aligned to promote the educational aspirations of the individual student, but in a way that's practical, will allow them to be able to make good financial decisions they'll be able to fulfill in the future.
I'd like to say one other thing about that. We could rename this the Save Higher Education and the Middle Class Act. We're losing them. We're losing higher education because it's getting outpriced. You see these campuses and buildings are going up right and left, and who's paying for it? American taxpayer. It's not the money that's going in to the tuition, per se. It's the money coming from taxpayers, from the people and the students that can't pay for their loans. It's coming from the taxpayers. We can't afford to do that. We got to cut spending somewhere, and we got to pay for something. Education is not free. It's not free. We got to pay for it. Parents had to pay for it. My parents paid for it. A lot of your parents paid for it. You borrowed loans. But we got to come to some sense of reality here, because we're losing what higher education is. It should not be a big business, but it is. Trillions of dollars are spent. Trillions of dollars. And we got to come back down to reality and put it all in perspective. It is about education, which is the number one priority in this country, for the number one commodity in this country, which is our young people. That's our number one commodity. And so we got to put it back in perspective, where the money's coming from, where it's going, and who's paying for it. And I think that the bottom line is, we all understand where it's coming from. We have to put our nose to the grindstone, and everybody should have to pay for their own in one form or another.
Yes, ma'am.
It does seem that many of the policies being outlined here would impact students who have yet to borrow, who are considering taking a loan to pay for their education. The administration's proposals target those who have kind of already incurred that sort of debt. I'm curious what you would say to those who are looking at that $20,000 of relief and saying that would make a big difference for me. I've already incurred that debt.
First, and I think John may wish to speak to this, there are already multiple loan repayment programs already in law for people who've lost their job, for people who go into certain types of work. They can, for people whose repayment amount exceeds a certain amount of their discretionary income. And discretionary income does not include what you have to pay for rent and food. Those programs are there. They're complex, and I think Cornyn is trying to simplify the system. But I can tell you, every president has come along and attempted to address this, and they've addressed it for the people that need it. Under President Biden's plan, a neurosurgeon and his wife, the cardiovascular surgeon, in their training, maybe making less than $250,000, but having a real nice potential to pay off loans in the future, they can have $20,000 knocked off their debt. That's not somebody up to $250,000 as a couple can have $20K knocked off their debt. Now, that's not targeted relief. That's just kind of like, I'm running for re-election, I better get out there with a program in order to grab some votes from the left. And that, I don't think the taxpayer should subsidize that. John?
I can't improve on that.
Okay. Yes, sir.
So two questions. First, is there any concern that these policies could limit, mobility, especially for those of the least means trying to get an education and somewhere different in society, particularly the graduate student loans? And then kind of off topic, wondering your thoughts on the reaction to the recent news regarding reports that Chinese scientists were the first to get sick in Wuhan lab.
Can we leave Wuhan later? We can talk about that off. I would argue that student loan debt is an anchor on people's feet, and that is what is keeping them from mobility. That is the reason kids are having to move back to their parents' basement, because they can't afford the debt. And in some cases, they did that enrolling in a program at a university in which it was predictable that they would not graduate. I like what he said. We're trying to make it so that this person has a future, not untethered by student loan debt, which predictably they would not be able to pay back. So I would flip that around, flip the premise, and say we're trying to rescue that. Any comments on that?
Well, at the end of the day, college is too expensive. It's gotten way out of hand. And we've got to bring that back to reality, is bring the expense down to where people can afford it. Remember, education is a sacrifice, and it's hard work, and it's dedication, and it's not for everybody when it comes to higher education. It's not for everybody. And for some reason, over the last 20 years, we've got to the point where we feel like everybody's got to go to a 4-year university. They don't have to go. We've got two-year universities. We got workforce development. We got all kinds of things. People can make a lot more money than they can with some of these degrees that even some of my players got over the years, which now they're having to work other places because their degrees don't work. And we got to come to that reality.
Mark Valley.
It seems like a lot of the legislation is aimed at STEM training, job training, and at the expense of liberal arts education, which is a critical thinking education. Is it job training? What happens to English majors?
A couple things. John, you may be referring to John's legislation. I'll let him speak to it. The idea that if I can, you want to talk to it? I mean, the point being, if the degree that you're taking $50,000 a year, a cumulative debt of $200,000 is going to pay you $40,000 a year, I don't think the federal taxpayer has to subsidize that. I mean, why? Because when we say federal taxpayer, we're talking about the guy at home who's driving a truck, trying to pay his bills, never went to college because he just couldn't afford to go to college. He had to start high school, start working right out of high school, and we're going to have him subsidize a lifestyle choice. Now, someone can still go, but you can go to LSU and pay tuition, which is far more reasonable, or Southeastern or University of Louisiana Lafayette, than going to a private university and get the same degree in English. So you may choose to go to that higher university, but why should the federal government, why should your children subsidize that choice? I don't see that that's necessarily an entitlement. I just don't. John, do you want to speak to that?
I wouldn't see this as discriminating against the liberal arts education. I graduated with a journalism degree till I found out how much they paid cub reporters. And then I decided maybe I need to go back to school. I became a lawyer. But the fact is, we want to preserve the choices for people. Some people may say, "Well, this, I want to write for a living, or I want to do the arts, or something like that." That's fine. We don't want to prohibit people from doing that sort of thing. But they ought to go into it with their eyes wide open, and with the kind of counseling and asking the questions any of us would ask when we borrow money. Can I pay this back? And then, of course, making sure that we preserve what I think is a fundamental character issue, which is personal responsibility. The Biden administration ignores any sort of accountability or personal responsibility. You borrow all this money, you can't pay it back, and that's not my problem, that's somebody else's problem. That's, I think, really undermines the character not only of the people involved, but of the country as a whole, and I think that's a very bad message to send.
And I'm going to say one more thing. We should flip that, Mark. We should also say, if the university knows that the graduate in this curriculum can only earn that much amount of money, why are they charging so much more than the earning potential? I think that is a valid reason. My colleagues have left. I'll wrap it up. Thank you all very much for being here.